Our reading from the Hebrew Scriptures, our second scripture reading, is from the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 18, verses 5 through 9, 15, and 31 through 33. So, we're doing a summer whirlwind tour through the life of King David. Last week we heard how the prophet Nathan condemned David for his assault on Bathsheba and his murder of her husband Uriah. And the prophet told David that violence would be sown into his house. He had opened the door to violence, and now violence would never leave his house. And in keeping with that dark prediction, David's own son Absalom has risen up against David in rebellion. He wants to be the king. And confusingly in this reading, the rebels are named Israel. So try to keep that in mind. When I talk about Israel, those are the rebels in this reading. So listen to the word as it might come to you, as it might speak into your life this morning from 2 Samuel chapter 18, beginning at verse 5. The king David ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom, his son." And all the people heard when the king had given this order to the commanders concerning Absalom to deal gently with him. So the army went out into the field against Israel. Remember, the rebels, Israel. And the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. The men of Israel, the rebels, were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding his mule in retreat, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his hair caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule under him went on. The 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said to David, "Good tidings for my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all those who rose up against you." And the king David said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May all the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Oh, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. You know, in the 1500s, in the Renaissance era, these words of mourning were sung at every funeral because you can hear the genuineness of them. They're inarticulate. They are piercingly clear. You can hear their bottomless grief. It's urgent. It's a true lament. All grief is hard. But what kind of grief is it when you have to grieve somebody who hurt you? In the way that Absalom had to be grieved by his father David, in the way that Absalom wanted to hurt his father David. Absalom, as we said, had mounted a rebellion against the king, his father. And he would have shed no tears, I think. Absalom would not have wept. He would not have given us this song of mourning that David gave us if the shoe had been on the other foot. Absalom really hated his father, and not without reason. I think Absalom really did want to kill him. The tragic poetry of this ancient text speaks to something that exists in most of us, or at least many of us, which is how hard it is to love somebody who hurts us. Just how hard it is to love somebody who hurts us. Or grieving the death of somebody who did not love us as well as they should have. Or maybe even just being sad for a relationship that can never be. One that we thought would finally get set right someday and just never did. Whether because the other person died or because they went away or whatever. It's hard to love somebody who hurts you. And I'm not talking about real abuse here. If it's real abuse, you got to get out. I'm talking about these everyday relationships with people who hurt us. We're a jumble of mixed feelings. The people we love end up being the ones who hurt us the most. And our hearts are divided about them. We feel guilty for not feeling about them the way we think we should feel about them. But truly, you can't control the things you feel. You can control what you do with them. But you can't control those things. So let's stop judging ourselves so harshly for not always feeling the way we think we're supposed to feel about people. When you're an adult, sometimes you've got to hold two conflicting truths in tension, and you've got to hold them both, even though they contradict each other, and it doesn't make any sense. Love doesn't make sense. You've got to embrace two truths that contradict each other. You hurt me, I love you. Somewhere hidden away in eternity, deep in the life and the mind of God, perhaps the wrinkles unfold and everything is made clear and right. I like to think that all love is made good in the end. For now, let's take love when and where we can get it. For most of us don't love quite as well as we could. The Native American poet and fiction writer Sherman Alexie wrote a memoir about his tangled relationship with his mother. He kind of adored her, he definitely hated her. And after she died, he was free to write a book about her. It's one of those tell-all books that you could never write during a person's life. He makes her sound like a really awful person who occasionally behaved like an angel. And he spends much of the book just wallowing in guilt over the fact that he couldn't love his mother as much as he felt like he was supposed to. You know, it's okay, it's maybe even fashionable for an artist to have a tortured relationship with their father. I think you see that all the time. But everyone is expected to adore their mother. I bought the hardcover at the beach earlier this summer, and I read all 456 pages in 2 days. I am typically a slow reader because I stop and Google everything. Oh, I've never heard of that. Let's see what it is. And so I get sidetracked when I read. But this book I read in 2 days. This autobiography was somehow just so gripping. There was a lot of humor in it, for one thing. It's a very funny book. And there's poetry, so that makes the pages a little shorter. And there are anecdotes, and there are reminiscences, and there are essays. And my favorite, there are character sketches of all the people in the family. He tells you about all of them. His twin sisters who never married and lived in the same house for the rest of their lives together. He tells you about all these characters, and it's just beautiful. Alexie grew up poor on an Indian reservation in Washington State. Lillian, his mother, was a complex personality, and she really was worthy of a book. She was one of the very last native speakers of their tribal language, and she taught strangers how to speak that language, but she never taught her children how to speak it. And I think Sherman Alexie never quite forgave her for that. She was a marvelous quilter. There's a quilt on the cover of the book that she made. And quilt is a kind of folk art, you know, and she sold her lovely quilts to supplement the family's meager income because her husband, their dad, was always going from job to job. Lillian was a practitioner of several religions at once. She practiced the old ways, the traditional rituals of her tribe. In addition to that, she was a Catholic. She was a confirmed Catholic, but she might be Pentecostal some days. Depended on her mood. And that, too, she never shared with her children. She left them at home on Sunday mornings. I mean, I think most parents want to share their language and their faith with their children. Lillian had been a wild drunk who would go on benders, disappearing for days, forgetting that she had small children at home, raising each other. One day she saw the harm that she was doing to her family, and she quit drinking cold turkey. She never went to AA. She just stopped drinking. Lillian would go out of her way to help neighbors in need, taking food and school supplies to a poor white family that bought a house on the reservation because it was so cheap. And then she remained gracious when the father of that family scolded her. "I don't need your charity." She remained gracious in the face of that. And yet, she said cruel things to her children, and she threw things at them. And she was especially hard on Sherman because she deemed him uppity. He didn't like life on the reservation. He was reading all the time. He wanted something else. Of the 5 children, he was the bookish one, the one who liked to dream and read and be alone. I guess I kind of identified with that in the book because I too had 4 siblings. There were 5 of us, and I was the one who always got mocked for reading books. That's kind of where the similarities end. I think Lillian felt judged by her son Sherman for his desire for a life other than the one that she could give him. She was doing the best she could, and yet he wanted something else, something more, and I think she felt judged by that. In some ways, she really did work to support her kids. She quit drinking cold turkey for them, unlike their dad, who drank himself to death. She quilted to support them. She had a real kind of love for them, but it was imperfect. It was tangled. It was broken. As an adult at her funeral, of course, Sherman is the writer. He's given the task of giving her eulogy at the funeral. And he bumbled through some of his most inarticulate words ever. All he could say was, "It's nice to hear how nice she was to all of you. I know you're supposed to say nice things at a funeral, but I'm glad to hear how nice she was to you because she wasn't that nice to me." That's not a great eulogy. Everybody deserves, I think, us to dwell on their better points at the end, at least at their funeral. Maybe admitting to the truth of some of the other stuff, but dwelling on the good stuff. And Sherman, the writer, the wordsmith, was fully at a loss of words in the face of his greater loss. And what loss is that? The loss of the possibility that he would ever go back and have a good relationship with his mother. As long as she's alive, you can still maybe do it. There might still be an opportunity to get it right, to go back and mend fences, to build bridges. But at her funeral, he had to admit that this vague notion of maybe repairing this relationship, it was gone. It was too late. It would never happen. Don't many of us have a relationship like that with someone living or someone dead? We love them, but they hurt us. Sometimes we hold those two truths in tension. And so here's another story. The story of David. I keep telling you to read 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel first. 2 Samuel is a sequel. Where to start with the story of this difficult son of David, Absalom? I will give you a whirlwind tour of this young prince's brief and urgent life. Absalom was David's favorite son. He was the 3rd son, but he was so charming and so good. David loved him more than his other children. Absalom was immensely popular with the people. He was charismatic, and he was good-looking. And he grew his hair out long because he liked the way it flashed in the wind behind his chariot, and he made 50 runners run in front of his chariot. This guy was vain. But people loved him because he was charismatic. He talked to them like he knew them. He might have been, I don't know, is it Prince Harry? Kind of the Prince Harry of the royal family, the rebel who everybody loved. That's kind of who Absalom was. One day, one of Absalom's brothers, there's a lot of rape in 2 Samuel. And so here's your trigger warning, and I apologize. Behaved inappropriately. The brother behaved inappropriately to one of the sisters. Absalom told on him. Absalom went to David with it. David didn't do anything. David was more concerned with being a king than a father. Absalom was infuriated. And so he took matters into his own hands, and he had that brother assassinated. And that made David really mad. You can do that to one of my daughters, but you don't kill one of my sons. I don't know. David got really mad then. And David had Absalom, his favorite son, exiled for 3 years. And when Absalom came home, he pretended he was all repentant, all changed. Everything's good, I'm chastened, I've learned my lesson. All the while he was sneaking around, mustering an army to raise against his father, to overthrow him, and to become the king, to take his place. This is intrigue. This is royal family intrigue, the kind you haven't seen since the Plantagenets or the Tudors. Absalom used to sit outside the king's court, and when people would come in with their grievances to sit before David and have things decided, he'd say to them at the gate, you know, David, my dad, he's a good guy, I guess, but he's not going to give you justice. He doesn't care about justice. You deserve a king who cares about justice. You deserve a king who's going to give you what you need. You deserve a king who's going to love you as much as you love him. And thus he won the people over to his side. Absalom was dearly loved by all the people. And besides, David had kind of lost favor with them since the whole Bathsheba thing. And when at last Absalom had an army bigger than his father's army, he attacked. David and his bodyguards, some 600 men, fled into the countryside. David gives the command, listen, officers, don't hurt my son. Bring him to me alive. Don't hurt him. But they've got their own reasons for hating David. He set fire to a barley field back when he was a teenager. They still hated him for that. All kinds of stuff. The battle was fought in the sinister-sounding forest of Ephraim. Isn't that great? And in the dark poetry of the text, it says that the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. One of those victims is Absalom, for his long flowing hair is blowing behind him as he's riding away in retreat, and it gets caught in the branch of a tree, and he's suspended between heaven and earth, and Joab gives the order, just kill that vain pretty boy. I don't want to see him again. And they kill him. It's an absurd picture. It really makes fun of Absalom, really, dangling by his long hair, the hair of his vanity, between heaven and earth. And David's grief is the stuff of poetry and song. Oh, my son, Absalom. My son, Absalom. I wish I could have died instead of you. Absalom, my son, my son. Somehow that's too real, isn't it? Somehow it's too much what we might say in such a situation. It has the real ring of history about it. Surely David knew that he was partly to blame for this mess. Surely David felt some guilt here. He had been an inconsistent father and a more devoted king than a parent. Absalom had real reasons for calling David unjust, and maybe deep in his parental heart, David believed that someday they could mend fences. They could heal the rift. Even after this war, this rebellion, that it wasn't too late to become the boy's attentive father. Here David is left to grieve for a loved one who rose up against him and hated him and might have wanted seriously to kill him. What do you do with that? What do you do? I thought I knew the answer when I started writing this sermon. I got this far into it and realized, I don't know. I don't know what you do with this. I had an outline. I had a thesis statement. I had supporting paragraphs. They didn't work. They all dissolved when I got to this raw truth that sometimes we love people who do us harm. And maybe the stories of Lillian and Absalom are the sermon themselves. Those stories themselves remind us that it's okay to have conflicted feelings about people. It's okay to love people who are difficult to love. It's common to grieve a relationship that was never right or one that got broken. We can't change the way we feel because feelings are sincere. Feelings come from the heart. We don't have to change the way we feel. We can control what we do about our feelings most of the time. But feelings are the kind of things you just have to accept. and own and live with until they either change or go away or just remain the same. And we've learned how to live with them. All love is crazy love. At least that's what Mary Oliver, the poet, says, and she's right about almost everything. I say almost, though I've never caught her being wrong. All love is crazy love. Grief is a face of love, and love doesn't have to make sense. Love never makes sense. That's what differentiates love from the logical things like justice and fairness. Love is never fair. We love those whose stories we know. We love those with whom we've shared our lives and our homes. We love those in whom we see pieces of ourselves and who have put pieces of themselves in us. We love people not because they're good and they deserve it, though many of them do, and most of them do much of the time, but that's not why we love them. We love them because we've seen them. We know what makes them tick. We know what makes them sad. We know what hand we had in who they are. Their failures, their successes. We love them because they're ours. Our feelings about them don't have to make sense, and they won't. In his book about his mother, Sherman Alexie includes this poem. Most of his poetry is a little better than this, at least in that it doesn't rhyme in that old-fashioned way. But hear this poem for what it is. He says this: "This poem is for everyone in my life, my sons, my friends, my mother, my siblings, my wife. It's a cuff to the head, a self-rebuff. Dear ones, I have not loved you well enough." Maybe that is enough to take from the story of Absalom and the story of Lillian. But I love you. Instead of saying, I love you, but you hurt me, maybe we can just say, but I love you. I won't let you hurt me. I won't let you control me. I won't listen to your abuse, but I love you. It's always good to love. And maybe the redemption of the world is exactly this, that love becomes enough in the end. That all loves are finally brought into their perfection. That in the vast economy of the life of God, all that ought to be is. Let us live with that hope. In the meantime, we might have to hold two mutually contradictory truths in tension. And sometimes I think they almost sound like the kind of thing that I think God says to me at times. You dishonor me. You offend me. You mess up a lot. But I love you. But I love you. Amen.